And I asked you guys to read this article, and basically what John Noonan wants to argue, as I was just saying a second ago, is that someone is a person if they are conceived by human parents. So from the moment of conception, according to John Noonan, you're a person and you have a right to life. John Noonan, as you can see right here, he was a justice on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's the court that's out west, and he was a Berkeley law professor, in fact. And he defends a very conservative pro-life position here. Now, it's one thing to take a position, but it's quite another thing to, in fact, defend it. And so what we want to do is we want to look at how does Noonan go about establishing that someone is a person if they are conceived by human parents. And what Noonan does, he lays out an argument in the short essay I asked you guys to read, and I'll be quite honest, it's not exactly clearly laid out. So what I've tried to do is distill Noonan's argument and break it down into the most concise way that I can see fit. And there's room to debate here, but hopefully you'll see that there is some logic to the way I've described it. You might have a different way of understanding it, and your way might be just as good, if not better, than the way I understand Noonan's argument. But here's how I understand Noonan's argument for this position. He lays it out in these two premises and conclusion. And here's what it says. Criteria for personhood cannot be arbitrary nor vague and must be morally relevant. Premise 2. Conception is the only criterion that is neither arbitrary nor vague and is morally relevant. Therefore, conception should be the point at which we determine when someone is a person. Now, what Noonan is basically doing is he's laying out conditions. He's laying out criteria for personhood. He's describing properties that any good criterion of personhood must meet. And he lists 3, or he seems to assume that there would be 3. One is that criteria for persons cannot be arbitrary. Now, what does it mean to say that something is arbitrary? Well, basically it just means that you pulled it out of thin air. You know, if I were to take a hat and fill it up with a bunch of numbers and I shake it around and then you reached in and you grabbed a number out, and let's say you picked 43 and I said, hey, why did you pick 43? What's the reason? You really wouldn't be able to give a reason, right? You'd say, I just picked it at random. There's no reason for it at all. That's what it means to be arbitrary. If something is arbitrary, if you can't give a good reason for it, if you're just kind of plucking it out of thin air at random. And so what Noonan says, he's like, hey, look, if you're given criteria for personhood, you have to have a good, sound reason behind that criterion. It has to meet certain kind of intellectual standards. And I think that seems kind of obvious. I think Noonan might be right there, that your criteria can't be arbitrary. Furthermore, he says that criteria for personhood, they can't be vague. Now, what do I mean by vague here? Well, he means a couple of different things, but basically he means that your criteria have to be well defined. They can't be poorly defined. And furthermore, I think what he would add to it also is when we talk about something's being vague, it's not just that it's necessarily poorly defined. That's one way something can be vague, but things can also be vague in another sense. Many properties that individuals have or that objects have or that are had by pretty much anything occur along a continuum. So take a feature like being bald. Some men are bald. They have no hair on their head. Some men, on the other hand, have a full head of hair. This is going to date me here, but Telly Savalas, none of you some of you might know, or Mr. Clean, right? Bald, clearly bald. On the other hand, Jimi Hendrix, full head of hair. Now, you have these extreme ends of the spectrum here. But somewhere in the middle, it's going to get vague. It's going to be unclear which side you fall on. Are you bald or do you have a full head of hair? And imagine that you took someone with a full head of hair and you just started plucking hairs out one at a time. And after every one you ask, is he bald? Is he bald? Is he bald? Is he bald? At a certain point, you're just going to get to a place where you say, I don't know, maybe not. I don't know. And when you hit that spot, what you've done is it's gotten vague. It's not clear what side they fall under. And so what Noonan is saying here is that conditions for personhood, they can't be vague in this sense, that they fall along a spectrum and you can't clearly place them in one category or another. And again, that seems something intuitive about that. You can't have something just kind of floating out there. It's like, oh, maybe it's a person, but it's not. It's just poorly defined. I think Noonan wants to avoid exactly that problem. And then finally, he says that your conditions need to be morally relevant. Now, here's the thing. We could come up with any condition for personhood that we wanted. I could, for instance, say someone is a person if they were born on, let's say they're born. It's like 5 months, 6 days, 21 hours, 3 minutes, and 14 seconds. That's a clear condition for personhood. That's when they become a person. But I just made that up, and it seems nothing morally significant about it at all. Why that period of time? Why 5 months? I don't even remember what I just said. 21 days or whatever. Why that? What's morally significant about that? Or here's another condition for personhood. At one time, sadly, in our nation's history, some people said that in order to be a person, you had to have white skin. That people who had black skin weren't persons. But here's the thing. Your skin color, it's not morally relevant in terms of your personhood. It shouldn't make a difference in the world what your skin color is as to whether or not you're deemed to be a person and have a right to life. It's just as insignificant as your hair color, or whether or not you're right-handed or left-handed, or whether or not you're short or tall, or skinny or large. It's irrelevant. It doesn't make a moral difference at all in terms of your personhood. And so what Noonan says is that if you're laying out conditions for personhood, they have to be, number one, they can't be arbitrary. Number two, they can't be vague, meaning they can't be ill-defined or occur along a continuum and not fall into a clear class. And then finally, they have to be morally relevant. You can't appeal to any condition whatsoever. And, along these lines of moral relevance, I just want to say is that we do recognize at a very in an obvious way that some things are morally relevant. Your skin color, not morally relevant. But whether or not you can feel pain, that's morally significant, right? And as I said before, that's why we can raise and grow and eat plants and kill plants, and it doesn't make a moral difference. But we can't, just indiscriminately kill creatures that can feel pain, because pain is morally significant. Now, Noonan's going to want to say that human biology is also morally significant, and we'll see why he says that later on. But here's his basic argument that he lays out. Criteria for personhood, they cannot be arbitrary, they cannot be vague, and they must be, as he says, morally relevant. Then number two, he's going to say conception is the only criterion that is not arbitrary nor vague and is morally relevant. And so he's going to conclude that conception should be the point at which we determine when someone is a person. And, I guess it'd be good for you to take a second and just think about this argument and whether or not you find it persuasive. And for me, I'm willing to grant premise one. That one seems, somewhat intuitive. At least at the present, I don't have a good reason to question it. But of the two premises he lists, premise two seems a lot more questionable. He says conception is the only criterion that is not arbitrary nor vague and is morally relevant. And we need to ask, why? Why does he say this? Why this particular, why conception is the only one? Why this particular criterion is the only one that meets these conditions? And what Noonan is basically going to do is he's going to walk through and he's going to provide a number of different criteria, and he's going to rule each one of those out. And after he rules each one of these out, he's going to settle on conception. And he's going to say, well, look, conception is the only man left standing, so to speak. We've examined all the other possibilities. We've ruled them out. and conception is the only one left. So let's look at some of the possible candidates for personhood, possible criteria that Noonan considers. So here's the first one that he considers, proposed criterion, viability. And what a lot of people say is that a fetus is a person at the stage in which it becomes viable. And what we mean by viable here is that the fetus can live outside of the mother's womb. Once the fetus gets to the point where it can live outside of the mother, where it, without the use of her body, then it is a person. Prior to that, it's not a person. And what's important to note here too is that when we talk about viability, something is viable, at least it has been defined historically within the Supreme Court case of Roe v. Wade and in philosophical literature as well, is that viability, it includes the ability to live outside of the mother's womb. And here's a key part, even with the aid of artificial assistance. Even with the aid of artificial assistance. Now, why would that be attached to it, a definition of viability? Why would it matter that even with the aid of artificial assistance? Well, just for the following reason. Because there are a lot of clear cases of persons who wouldn't be viable if that condition wasn't in place, and so therefore they wouldn't be a person. So think about, for instance, a premature baby, or even some babies that are born at 9 months that require being in an incubator or require having an artificial lung to pump oxygen into their body. Well, if being able to live outside of the mother's womb required that you had to do all your breathing on your own, then technically even a newborn baby that required being hooked to a machine wouldn't be viable, and so wouldn't be a person. But that doesn't seem like a very good reason to deny its personhood. It's just that it needs a little bit of assistance. So when we talk about viability here, what we mean, I think what people mean is that the fetus is no longer uniquely dependent on this particular woman. Prior to a certain stage, the fetus must be inside of this woman. I mean, we can't take, we haven't reached the point in technology where we can just have a full-fledged so-called test tube baby where we could inseminate an egg and then grow it within a laboratory. It requires being inside of a woman for a certain period of time. But what we mean by viability is that the fetus is no longer uniquely dependent on this woman, that we can extract it and it can live on its own. So that's what we mean. Well, what Noonan does is he attacks this as a condition for personhood. And what he says about this is just this. Viability is vague. Viability is vague in just a sense I was talking about a second ago, where it paints itself as somewhat of a moving target. And think about this, is that according to Noonan, he says, number one, different races develop at different rates. I think African American children, they develop faster than white children, and women develop in the womb faster than men. And so what we see here is that there's going to be a vagueness that's introduced as to whether or not something or someone has become viable, dependent on these kinds of considerations of race or gender. Not only that, but viability is a vague criterion because it's an ever-shifting one depending on one's medical technology. In the United States, we have very good medical technology. We have very good forms of prenatal care. And at this point, I think that there have been cases where children have been born week 24, some even a little bit earlier, week 22, and they've lived. Now, if you've been born at week 22 50 years ago, you were a goner. If you've been born at week 24 50 years ago, you were a goner. And so what we can see here is that as our technology has increased, the moment of viability has been pushed further and further and further back. So it's this ever-moving kind of condition. Not only that, but we can add there's an arbitrary element to it as well. And here it is. If you're born in the United States where we have very good medical care, let's say you're born at week 24, you'd be viable. But let's say that your mother just happened to take a trip to Haiti for some reason, and then for medical reasons had to give birth at week 24. Well, they don't have good medicine there. And so for them, you in that country, you wouldn't be viable. And think about this. If you're born in one country, because of the technology, you'd be viable and so a person. But if you're born in another country, even though you are developed to the same rate, just because the technology there is different, you wouldn't be a person and so wouldn't be viable. And that seems like it's a problem, because basically what it's saying is your personhood hinges on the technology that just happens to exist around you. And that doesn't seem at all right. Whether or not you're a person should not be determined by something extrinsic to you. Whether or not you're a person is a function of your intrinsic features, not what's going on in the world around you. So, like I said, not only is viability vague, there's something also arbitrary about using this as a condition for personhood, according to John Noonan. So, based on this, he says, hey, viability, that's not a likely candidate for a criterion for personhood. So, the second condition that Noonan considers, or the second criterion he considers, is just this: experience. And what he says is that a being who has had experience, has lived, has suffered, who possesses memories, is a person. And this is another possible criterion for personhood. Well, Noonan attacks this one as well, and he actually spends quite a bit of time attacking this. But what he says about this, he's got a lengthy response, is he says experience is not well defined. And what he means by this is that, look, when we talk about experience, we could define this in a very narrow way, or we could define it in a very broad way. And if we define it in a very narrow way, then you might say something like this. To have experienced something means that you have consciously experienced it and you possess some form of memory of it. Here's the thing. If you take that narrow a definition of experience, well, then a lot of clear cases of people will no longer be people, because infants don't possess those kinds of narrow experiences where they can remember things. I doubt any of you remember being born. I don't think you remember, like, whoa, I'm sliding out. I don't think any of you, that was inappropriate. But anyways, none of you probably remember that at all. And certainly newborns, they don't have memories. And in fact, your memories don't develop until a little bit later. So if you define experience in this kind of narrow way, well, then a lot of things that should be counted as people won't be people. On the other hand, you might say, well, let's take a broad definition of memory. Of experience, where you just have to experience in some kind of way things. Well, here's something Noonan says. If that's what you want to do, well, then fetuses are persons, because they do have experiences. They have some kind of experiences. Heck, even an embryo has some kind of experience. And so what he says is you can't really assess this kind of criterion because it's just not well defined. It's vague. What's being said here? On a narrow construal, then we run the risk of ruling out clear cases of people. On a broad construal, then fetuses are persons. More to the point, Noonan says, as it turns out, experience just seems, he thinks, morally irrelevant. And what he says here is he's like, look, it's just not clear why experience as such confers personhood. It seems like it would be something different. It's not that you experience that makes you a person. It's something more fundamental that's what makes you a person. Well, Noonan then turns to another possible candidate, or another possible criterion for personhood, which is the sentiment of the parents. And this is something you hear sometimes, is basically that if the parents view the fetus as a person, then it's a person. If the parents don't view the fetus as a person, then it isn't a person. So whether or not the fetus should be a person is a function of the parents' own sentiments, their own feelings about the infant. And Noonan attacks this one also, and what he says, again, is very similar to what he said before, which is just, this is morally irrelevant. And the problem here with a condition like this is basically personhood is being determined by how people feel about you or think about you or perceive you. And Noonan says that's not important at all. What makes you a person is a feature intrinsic to you, something about you. It's not about external things in the world. It's not about how other people might view you. It's about you. And this condition fails in this way also. It's morally irrelevant, just like some of the other ones we've seen. Noonan then considers a fourth possible criterion for personhood, which is that of social visibility. And what he says here is very similar actually to the last one, is he says that a fetus is not socially perceived as a person, and it cannot communicate with others, thus both subjectively and objectively, it is not a member of society. So what this condition is basically saying is just this, is that in order to be a person, you have to be a member of society. Fetuses aren't members of society in any kind of clearly perceivable way, so therefore they're not persons. And Noonan, once again, he rejects this also for the same reasons we've seen before, which is just this seems morally irrelevant. Why should whether or not people perceive you as being involved in society dictate whether or not you're a person? It shouldn't. It's irrelevant. As I said, personhood is something intrinsically determined. It's about you. It's not about how others view you. Nothing extrinsic. Moreover, what Noonan says here is that this criterion is too narrow, because basically it would deny personhood to any isolated individual. Say someone, a hermit living out in the woods who had no contact with society. Well, if this is what makes you a person, then he wouldn't be a person or she wouldn't be a person, and so they would lack a right to life. But surely they do. And again, the reason for that is not because of how we view them, but rather because of internal features that they possess. So having gone through these four conditions, Noonan then settles on, and he finally determines one that he thinks is a likely candidate for personhood, which is conception. And what he says here is that anyone conceived by a man or a woman is a person. Now, Noonan wants to say this does meet those three conditions he laid out, that it's not arbitrary, it's not vague, and it is morally relevant. And what Noonan says here is really important, because he has to give us a clear defense of why this is. Why conception? Now, what he can say about it not being vague, I think is probably going to be a little easier to say. Once conception has taken place, well, we kind of have a clear cutoff, right? Conception is well defined. We know at this moment the sperm has entered the egg, and the egg has been fertilized. And I mean, it's fairly clear cut. It's well defined. And so Noonan does clearly meet that particular condition or criterion that he laid out. But the bigger question for Noonan is, well, why is conception morally relevant? Why is conception morally relevant? And so he says a couple of things about this. And basically, his biggest point he makes here is that in a way, he kind of thinks it's just obvious that conception is morally relevant. But he says that what we see here that is so significant is the presence of a new genetic code. He says that at the moment conception takes place, something brand new and magical enters the world. We have the emergence of a unique genetic code that will determine not everything, but most everything about how this person develops and functions, and about their autonomy as an individual. The new genetic code we see is not the mom's genetic code, it's not the dad's, it's something brand new that is created. And so this is basically the centerpiece of Noonan's argument, is he thinks it's more or less just obvious that once this new creation occurs, this new genetic code emerges, that something morally significant has taken place. Now, he adds to this a little bit. And what he says to add to this is just this, is he says, not only do we see a new genetic code, the likes of which the world has never seen, but we see a significant jump in probabilities here. Now keep in mind this next point that he makes. He considers it just what he calls a buttressing condition. And basically what a buttress is just actually what a buttress is in big stone walls. The walls get too heavy to support themselves, and so people will create a buttress, which is just kind of like a brace along the wall to hold it in place. And so what Noonan considers is this next point about the shift in probabilities is that this is a buttressing condition. It's something to help demonstrate this idea that the presence of a unique genetic code is something important and something special. And here's what he says. Prior to conception taking place, a woman, she will, in the course of her life, ovulate about, I think, 400 eggs. She's born with, depending on the woman, somewhere in the upwards of 1 million eggs. So prior to conception taking place, the chance of any one of those eggs ever being born is slim to none, like 1 in 100,000. Or even greater, depending on the woman, because different women ovulate different number of eggs. They're born with a different number of eggs, but the chance of it ever, evolving into a person, ever being born, it's basically 1 in 100,000. Furthermore, what Noonan says is that in a single male ejaculation, the chance of one sperm ever developing or ever turning into a person and being born is basically like 1 in 1 million. Is almost impossible. However, once conception takes place, and you rule out any form of miscarriage, you factor in the fact that miscarriages do take place, the chance of that egg, of that conceptus reaching any being born is 4 in 5. And so what Noonan says here is just this. He says that prior to conception, there is basically a 1 in 100,000 chance of an egg ever being born. There's a 1 in 1 million chance of a sperm ever being born. Once conception takes place, however, those probabilities shift, and there's an 80% chance that it will reach maturity and be born. And so what he says is this demonstrates something very significant takes place. A moment prior, it's virtually impossible that this, either if we're looking at the egg or we're looking at the sperm, it's virtually impossible that it'll ever be born. Once conception takes place, it's a near certainty that it will. And Noonan says this demonstrates that at the moment of conception, something very, very special happens. And so conception is, as he argues, morally relevant.